For most people, Malcolm-Jamal Warner will always be Theo, the kid who grew up on television, the son who struggled, learned, laughed, and made an entire generation feel seen. His face felt familiar, safe, like someone you'd known forever. So when the news broke that he was gone, it didn't feel real. It felt wrong. At first, it sounded like a tragic accident, a vacation, the ocean, a moment that went too far. But as the details came out, something didn't sit right. The timeline shifted, the explanations changed. And then people started looking back at what Malcolm had been saying in the months before his death. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. This isn't just a story about how Malcolm-Jamal Warner died. It's about what he was trying to tell us before he did, and why so many people are only listening now. When the news first broke, it came the way these stories always do. Short, blunt, almost careless in how final it sounded. Malcolm-Jamal Warner, dead at 54, drowned while on vacation in Costa Rica. Authorities called it an accident, strong currents, wrong place, wrong moment. The kind of explanation that technically answers the question while somehow making everything feel worse. For fans, the shock wasn't just grief, it was disbelief. Malcolm wasn't someone people associated with recklessness. He wasn't known for excess or chaos. He wasn't a headline chaser. He was careful, thoughtful, intentional, the kind of person who always seemed aware of how fragile life could be. That's what made the story hard to swallow. At first, the reports didn't even agree with each other. Some early accounts said he'd been rescued by people on the beach. Later, that was corrected. Emergency responders said he had no vital signs when they reached him. He was taken directly to the morgue. No hospital stay. No recovery attempt that worked. Just gone. Those shifts in detail may have been innocent confusion, but they left a residue, a sense of unease. Especially because this wasn't happening in isolation. Malcolm hadn't been silent before his death. He hadn't been withdrawn. He had been speaking, reflecting, questioning. And when people went back to listen, what they heard felt different in hindsight. Just 2 days before he died, Malcolm released what became the final episode of his podcast. At the time, it didn't trigger alarms. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't titled like a farewell. But now, listening again, it lands with a weight that's impossible to ignore. He asked a question that felt philosophical on the surface, but carried something sharper underneath. What happens to a people who begin to accept the labels placed on them by those who benefit from their limitation? He didn't rush the question. He let it sit. He waited. Almost as if he wanted listeners to feel uncomfortable with the silence. That episode centered on identity, on the hood, on how Black life in America is flattened into caricatures while its contributions are absorbed and repackaged. Malcolm wasn't attacking where he came from. He was challenging the box people are expected to stay inside. He talked about how survival itself, especially in systems designed to exhaust you, is a form of excellence. At the time, it sounded like growth, maturity, perspective. Now, it sounds like urgency. Because Malcolm had always been careful with his voice. He never shouted. He never performed outrage. He chose his words slowly, deliberately. And in those final months, something had shifted. He wasn't looking backward at his career anymore. He was looking outward and forward. For most of the world, Malcolm-Jamal Warner would always be Theo Huxtable, the awkward, lovable son on the Cosby Show, the kid who struggled with dyslexia, the character who made mistakes, learned, and grew up in a house where Black intelligence and warmth were normalized on primetime television. That image followed him everywhere, and for a long time, he let it. Not because he didn't want more, but because he understood what that role meant to people. Theo wasn't just entertainment, he was representation. He was proof that Black boys could be gentle, thoughtful, unsure, and still worthy. But being Theo also came with a cost. When the Cosby Show ended, Malcolm made a decision that likely saved his life. He didn't chase the spotlight. He didn't cling to the image. He stepped back and rebuilt himself slowly. He directed, he wrote, he explored music and poetry. He worked consistently, not loudly. And that restraint mattered, because many child actors don't survive the transition, the pressure, the identity confusion, the industry that loves you young and forgets you fast. Malcolm avoided that trap not by accident, but by discipline. He had structure. He had a mother who protected him, and he had a sense of self that wasn't dependent on applause. Still, one shadow never fully lifted: Bill Cosby. Cosby didn't just cast Malcolm, he chose him, mentored him, corrected his speech, guided his professionalism. For years, Cosby was a father figure both on and off screen. So when the accusations came, they didn't just shake the industry, they shook Malcolm personally. More than 50 women came forward. The image of America's dad collapsed in public. And suddenly, Malcolm found himself in an impossible position. People wanted him to choose sides, to denounce, to defend, to simplify something that wasn't simple. He refused. Not because he was in denial, but because he understood complexity. He said he couldn't defend Cosby, but he also couldn't pretend that the man hadn't shaped his life. He acknowledged the pain of the victims. He acknowledged his own grief, and he criticized the media's hunger for spectacle over understanding. That nuance cost him. In a culture that prefers absolutes, Malcolm's refusal to turn trauma into a slogan made him uncomfortable. And then there was the other loss that cut even deeper. The Cosby Show disappeared from syndication, overnight, erased. For Malcolm, that wasn't just a business hit, it was personal. That show represented something rare, a vision of Black family life grounded in love, education, and stability. He worried that future generations would never see it, that they'd be told it was a fantasy instead of a possibility. And yes, the financial loss mattered too. He said it plainly. Losing syndication meant losing income. Work he had done as a teenager was still supporting him decades later. When it vanished, it took part of his livelihood with it. What changed him wasn't anger. It was a conversation. His on-screen sister reminded him that the show's impact couldn't be undone, that people had already been shaped by it, inspired by it. That erasure on television didn't erase lived influence. That reframing gave him peace. And from there, Malcolm moved forward. What stands out most about his life is what's missing. No arrests, no public breakdowns, no addiction headlines. In an industry built on implosion, Malcolm lived quietly, deliberately. He directed episodes of television. He earned Grammy recognition for music and spoken word. He took roles that challenged him instead of defining him. He wasn't chasing relevance, he was building depth. His losses were real, but they were private. Michelle Thomas, his former co-star, his former partner. She died young, from cancer. Malcolm was there. He grieved without statements or spectacle. Years later, he called her an angel, someone who lit up every room she entered. Later came a very different heartbreak, a public breakup, a relationship dissected by tabloids. That experience taught him something else, that not everything sacred survives exposure. After that, he pulled his personal life further inward, which is why many people didn't even know he was married or that he had a child. He believed love lived best away from cameras. So when he died, the world learned something new about him, that he had built a life of deep intimacy, that he was a husband, a father, a man whose greatest work may never have been seen by an audience. His death, officially ruled an accident, didn't end the questions. Not because people were searching for conspiracy, but because the timing felt heavy, because his voice had been sharpening, because his message had been deepening, and because history has taught people to notice patterns. No one is saying Malcolm-Jamal Warner predicted his death, but many feel he understood something about the moment we're living in, about the cost of honesty, about what happens when people begin speaking without cushioning their truth. He was no longer just reflecting on the past, he was challenging narratives, quietly, intelligently, without shouting. And then, suddenly, that voice was gone. What remains is the echo, not just of Theo, not just of a child star who survived, but of a man who lived carefully, spoke deliberately, and left behind questions instead of noise. And maybe that's why his absence feels so loud. As people began revisiting Malcolm's final months, something became clear very quickly. This wasn't a man retreating from life. This was a man leaning into it. He wasn't disappearing, he was clarifying. And that distinction matters because it reframes everything that came after. In the year leading up to his death, Malcolm-Jamal Warner had been doing something he hadn't done so openly before. He was speaking without performing, not acting, not presenting a polished version of himself, just talking, listening, questioning. His podcast wasn't built for virality. There were no shock clips, no outrage hooks. It felt intimate, almost unfinished at times, like a conversation you weren't meant to overhear. And that's exactly why it felt honest. He talked about exhaustion, not in the way celebrities usually do, but in a deeper sense. The fatigue that comes from carrying expectations placed on you when you're a child and never being allowed to fully put them down. He reflected on how early success can trap you in a frozen version of yourself that the world keeps demanding you replay. Theo forever, the good kid, the safe image. He never said he hated that role. He respected it. He understood what it meant. But he was also honest about how limiting it could be. How people often stopped listening once they decided they already knew who you were. That's why his later work mattered so much to him. Music became a refuge. Spoken word became a release. Directing allowed him to step behind the lens and shape stories instead of being shaped by them. These weren't career pivots driven by desperation. They were choices driven by intention. Malcolm wasn't trying to stay famous. He was trying to stay whole. One of the most revealing things about him was how rarely he centered himself in conversations about race and culture, even when he easily could have. He didn't position himself as a spokesperson. He positioned himself as a participant. Someone still learning, still listening, still unlearning. That humility showed up again and again. When he spoke about Black excellence, for example, he didn't romanticize it. He complicated it. He questioned whether the term had been narrowed into something palatable for mainstream comfort. He talked about how survival, dignity, and presence are often overlooked forms of excellence, especially for people who are never rewarded for simply making it through. Those ideas didn't trend. They weren't quoted endlessly, but they stayed with the people who heard them. And then there was the quiet part of his life, the part he protected fiercely. Malcolm didn't hide his family out of secrecy. He hid them out of care. He believed intimacy deserved privacy, that love, once exposed to constant observation, starts performing instead of existing. He had learned that lesson the hard way, through years of watching relationships disintegrate under public scrutiny. So when the world learned, after his death, that he was a husband and a father, it felt jarring. Not because it was shocking, but because it revealed how much of his real life he had kept sacred. People who knew him personally described him as present, not distracted, not absorbed by his phone. He listened, he showed up, he remembered details, he laughed easily. He made people feel seen without making himself the center of attention. That's not the image most people associate with child stars, which is why his story continues to resonate. After his death, tributes poured in from fellow actors, musicians, and creatives who all seemed to echo the same sentiment. Malcolm was steady, Malcolm was kind, Malcolm was thoughtful. Those aren't words people use lightly in an industry built on ego and urgency. But outside of personal tributes, something else stood out: the silence. There were no massive televised memorials, no sweeping industry retrospectives, no sustained conversation about his impact. For someone who helped define a generation's understanding of Black family life on television, the response felt muted, and people noticed. Not in an accusatory way, more in a reflective one. Why do certain figures receive endless remembrance while others quietly fade from the spotlight? Why does thoughtful work often go uncelebrated compared to controversy? Why do voices that refuse spectacle sometimes get overlooked? These weren't new questions. Malcolm himself had been asking versions of them long before his death, which is why revisiting his final words feels unsettling. Not because they predicted tragedy, but because they asked us to look closer at what we reward, what we ignore, and who we truly listen to. He wasn't warning of danger. He was warning of erasure, of flattening complex lives into simple narratives, of mistaking silence for insignificance. In the weeks after his passing, fans returned to old episodes of The Cosby Show, not out of nostalgia alone, but curiosity. Watching Theo again, older viewers noticed things they hadn't before: the vulnerability, the insecurity, the emotional intelligence that felt rare on television then and still feels rare now. You could see pieces of Malcolm in that character. Not the polish, but the sensitivity. The same sensitivity people once worried would be a problem. The same sensitivity that made him thoughtful, reflective, and deeply human. That sensitivity didn't disappear when the cameras turned off. It matured. It became restraint. It became patience. It became purpose. And perhaps that's the most important part of his legacy. Malcolm-Jamal Warner didn't burn brightly and fade. He didn't implode. He didn't self-destruct. He lived deliberately. He chose growth over noise, depth over dominance, meaning over momentum. His death may have been ruled an accident, and there is no evidence suggesting otherwise. But the questions people are asking now aren't about suspicion. They're about timing, about voice, about why we so often begin paying attention just after someone stops speaking. Maybe that's the lesson he was leaving behind. Listen sooner, look deeper, value people while they're still here. Because not every message comes with urgency. Some arrive quietly, and if we're not careful, we miss them entirely. Malcolm-Jamal Warner didn't leave behind a scandal. He left behind a conversation, and it's one we're only beginning to have. If this story made you stop and think, don't let it fade with the credits. Like this video so Malcolm-Jamal Warner's voice continues to reach people who may have missed it. Share it with someone who grew up watching him and deserves to know the man beyond the role. And tell me in the comments, do you think we listen too late when voices speak quietly? And what part of Malcolm's story stayed with you the most? Some legacies aren't loud, they're lasting.